component-driven development and visual test coverage. So this is basically talking to you about kind of a testing movement that's going on right now in the front-end development community. It's extremely popular. There's like tens of thousands of people doing this. And most people don't even really realize that they're writing tests. So this is trying to kind of bridge the gap between some work that's going on in the front-end world and testing. My name is Michael Shilman. I am a maintainer of an open source project called Storybook, which will feature prominently in this talk. And I also am an engineer at a company called Chroma, which builds a SaaS around Storybook. This is a picture of me before I started working on testing. And I wouldn't say that was like a beautiful, bold hair, but a lot has happened thanks to testing, which I'm sure you can all relate to. So testing is really, really hard. We wouldn't be here talking about it all day if it wasn't challenging. I think we all face different types of testing challenges. And it's kind of an art. And there's never really a great solution for all problems in testing. But what I want to talk about today actually I think is a solution to a lot of these problems very consistently, but within a specific domain, which is UI engineering. But first, I'm going to complain more about testing and take some shots at some of my fellow speakers. So one of the big problems in testing is that nobody wants to write tests. And people hate testing so much that, according to Ryan earlier, you literally have to hack your own brain to write tests. I had never thought about it that way, but I thought red-green testing is kind of a way to force yourself to, you bake it into the process so that you never forget to write tests. We had a couple talks around code coverage, and this is a great way to remind yourself to test, or have you ever looked at your code coverage and felt really ashamed? It's also a way to shame yourself into testing. Another big problem in testing is that nobody knows what to test. And I was joking about this last night at the speaker's dinner with the testing pyramid, the testing ice cream cone, the testing diamond. I had never heard of a testing hourglass. I thought I invented it, but it's actually something that somebody already invented. We saw a testing trophy in the last talk. So I mean, it's still kind of a real open question. Nobody else on the team understands tests. So you have these multidisciplinary teams with product managers and designers, even other engineers who don't understand tests, don't know the value of tests. So we invent new languages like Gherkin, Cucumber, these types of things to try to communicate tests to other people on the team. We invent IDEs that make the stuff visual and show you the tests it's running. And these are just really hard problems. I'm not sort of trashing all these things because I think they're bad. I just think it's really hard. And UI testing is even harder than all this stuff. So UI testing has all the problems of what I just talked about, and it has some more kind of specific problems. So there's issues around, like at the UI, it's kind of really the top level of your app, so it's really integrating a lot of stuff. You need recording tools to kind of fake out your APIs. There are things like global variables in your CSS that can kind of ricochet around your entire code base. So even though we've learned that global variables are bad in general programming, somehow in UI programming that hasn't necessarily caught on yet. UI states are combinatorial. So if you look at a modern UI, it's typically made out of components. I'll talk more about that later. But a given app can have thousands of components. So Facebook, I think circa 4 years ago, had about 50,000 components in their UI. And I'm sure it's gone up a lot since then. And every single component has a number of states, like the loading state, the no data state, the error state, blah, blah, blah. All of those things, I guess for web testing, which is mostly what I'm talking about today, although I think this generalizes to all kinds of testing, should be tested in a whole bunch of different browsers. So that multiplies things out even more. A lot of these UIs are responsive, so they behave differently on mobile versus tablet versus desktop, so that's another multiplicative thing. Maybe you're themed, so you have different themes for your UI, that's another multiplier. And if you want to do things like testing for disabilities, for accessibility, then that's yet another multiplier. So a single component can have hundreds of different states that you might want to test if you want to be exhaustive, and you might have tens of thousands of components in your app. Most apps are not that big, but I'll show some apps that are not big and still have tons of components in them. And then the kicker is that at some level, every test is kind of like an integration test. So even if you are trying to test a component in isolation, which is what I'm going to talk about in this talk, there's still things like spinning up a new browser. These tests are flaky, just like we've talked about in a bunch of different talks here, test flakes. These tests are underspecified, so the HTML output, the DOM that your code produces, does not necessarily indicate what the visual output is, because it can render different in different browsers. So, so UI testing has all the testing problems and has a bunch more kind of specific problems. Maybe, maybe we're just doomed. Maybe we should just go home. And I'm happy to say that that's not the case. And this talk is not just me complaining. It's about component-driven development. And this is a development technique that front-end engineers and designers use to build out really complex UIs. And they don't build it to test their UIs necessarily, but in the process, they're actually also testing their UIs. And it solves pretty much every one of the problems that I talked about so far, and we'll kind of try to highlight that in the talk. So before we can talk about component-driven development, let's talk about components. Who here works on front-end code in React, Angular, any other kind of? OK, so it's a JS conference, and pretty much everybody has touched a component in some form. But just for completion, a component is a little snippet of code. In this case, it's a counter written in React. And it has some input variables, a label, and an initial count. It has some internal state, which is a count that it maintains. It uses another component, which is a button that has an event handler on it. And basically, these are the kind of nouns in component land. And we just want to test that these components do what they're supposed to do. Modern UIs are assembled from components. We want to make these things really fast, really simple. We want them to be modular and pluggable. We want these to be reusable across big code bases. Down at the bottom, I have a bunch of different logos. So all my examples are in React, which is what I'm most familiar with. But Vue, Angular, Ember, Riot, Marco, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch, even HTML web components is sort of a standard for these things in browsers. And at some level, they all boil down to pretty similar concepts. So what is component-driven development? So I'm going to walk through kind of a mock development flow here. And this is a design implemented in Sketch. And I think this is pretty typical of kind of a modern front-end build process, where you build something out in Sketch or Figma or Illustrator or Photoshop or some kind of image tool. It comes in from the designer. This is a very simple sign-up flow. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's a project I worked on a couple years ago. And this simple sign-up flow consisted of 60 screens, kind of specced out at 3 different device sizes. So this is what the screen should look like. This is what the landing page looks like on desktop. This is what it looks like on mobile, and so forth. And so if this streamlined flow has 60 screens, imagine what Facebook or something would have, a zillion of them. And I think this complexity is kind of table stakes for modern applications. And so the first step of component-driven development is we decompose each screen into a set of components. And so those components can be sections on the page, they can be individual widgets, charts, they can be small things like buttons and sliders. But it's about basically breaking that big problem down into a bunch of atomic problems and kind of intermediate problems. And then what we do is for each of these components that we've identified, we catalog the relevant states. So typically a component might have a loading state, a loaded state, no data found, error, and so forth. And it obviously depends on the components. But we kind of take an inventory of all this stuff. And then this is kind of the key slide, so I'll dig into this a little bit more later in the talk. But we build out these components in isolation. So when you're building out a UI, your UI is this, like, again, complex, tangled thing. And you don't necessarily even have a backend to talk to at that point. Somebody else is working on an API somewhere, and that's going on in parallel. You really just want to be able to focus on that particular component and build it out in isolation. So that means that you basically create or load some kind of dummy data, those props that go into your component. And so this is really the key point. And so you build up these small level components. You combine multiple components into higher level components. And then finally, at the end, when you're done, you recompose all of these components into screens. And at the point that they become screens, that's typically when you introduce in the real data and so forth. So you've built out these little components in isolation, and then you've assembled them up into big screens. So this is not rocket science. It's a very simple process. You take these things down, you break them down, you build it bottom up. And what I want to sort of show you guys today is that this process is actually like a testing process, and it solves all these testing problems amazingly. You just need to squint a little bit. So now I'll introduce Storybook. Storybook is this open source project that I maintain. It's a front-end tool, and it's used by front-end engineers throughout the industry. Tens of thousands of projects use Storybook, and I'll talk about some of those. And it's basically a UI for building out these components in isolation. You catalog your components and your states. It works with all those view layers that I showed earlier, and has a really big active community. So every component state in Storybook is called a story. It's not the same thing as like user stories that we talked about earlier. It's really just a set of data that comes into a component and forces that component into a particular state. And each story is just a JavaScript function. So this is kind of a dummy example. I'll show this more later. But I'm importing a button component, and I'm creating 3 different stories here: a normal state, a state where I'm rendering the button as a link. This is kind of a contrived example, and another state where I'm loading something into the button. And so I specify these stories, and this allows me to kind of have 3 different UI states of the component. Like I said, modern front-end engineers depend on it. This is a quote from somebody at Salesforce. Storybook is crucial to our UX process. The old way, which means building stuff out in the application itself, seems ludicrous now. And so hopefully what I described earlier about building stuff bottom up just kind of makes sense. It's not supposed to be rocket science, but it's something that up until recently people weren't really doing in the front-end space. Recently, over the summer, Twitter had a design overhaul. There was a big kind of controversy around it. That was done with Storybook on the kind of component implementation side. I just saw about an hour ago somebody from Slack tweeted Slack's Storybook. So basically, these are like the modern kind of teams with modern UI stacks that are using Storybook and really depending on it. And teams are writing thousands of stories. I don't know all the storybooks for all these companies, but I know that Airbnb was an early Storybook user and kind of runs a lot of their component building on it. Lyft is based on it, Salesforce, Slack, Squarespace, those companies that kind of have like big component libraries, but also lots of startups use it. And these stories are crafted. So you're not just throwing this stuff together. As a front-end developer, you basically have a visual spec for the thing that you're trying to produce, which is the design, and then you're kind of tweaking your component across these different breakpoints and so forth. And what that means is that you're tweaking this stuff, so you have an editor open on the right-hand side, you have Storybook open in a browser on your left-hand side, and you're kind of getting it right. And the thing is that once you've done that and you've committed it and so on, you might want to make some changes. So I'm changing something in some component somewhere, I'm editing some CSS line, I'm upgrading a library, whatever it is. And these minor tweaks can cause huge regressions because these component hierarchies are huge. And so these changes can ripple throughout the hierarchy in unexpected ways. But each of those specs that you created when you built out a story from your component is testable. And so this is basically, on the left-hand side, we have the old version, the baseline version of a story that we've visually snapshotted, taken an image of. And on the right-hand side, we have a new version of that story. And we can compare those things pixel to pixel and understand when something has changed. And that change was either intentional or it was an actual regression. And so the idea is that when you write these stories, which these teams are writing them without prompting, you get tests for free. And it's kind of a dirty secret because, like, although I'm telling you all is testing, like, I don't want people who are using Storybook and writing stories to think of it like testing because nobody wants to write tests, as we know. So once you kind of believe that, then you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. So this is an automated visual testing service for Storybook called Chromatic. It allows you to run this sort of suite of regression tests on every commit. It allows a fast visual workflow for kind of comparing those baselines and the new changes and certifying those. And then you can merge when it goes green. So each change gets summarized, linked off of GitHub. Of course, we test across different browsers and viewports. We support Chrome, Firefox, and IE. And you can specify the viewports you want. One of the things that's amazing when you're kind of building in this isolated environment is the performance that you can get. So I kind of whinged earlier about testing, integration testing, about like part of the problem with integration tests is flakiness, but part of it's just about speed. And here, this is a real test which has run about 2,000 tests in 45 seconds, which is just unheard of if you ever used like a UI testing like a Cypress or something. They're solving the end-to-end problem, and we're solving this kind of almost like unit testing for components. And we can do this because these components are stubbed out with mock data, which is quite amazing. And then if there is a difference, we have a very nice UI for kind of resolving those differences and reviewing. So I posit to you that all in all, this component-driven development is a remarkable test solution. And I want to go through kind of these different points from the beginning of the talk. So nobody wants to write tests, and we have to trick ourselves into writing tests. But for UI, like to deal with the complexity, not for testing, but people love to write stories and they depend on it. Nobody knows what to test. So these stories don't test everything. They don't necessarily test interactive behavior. But for visual stuff, I think what to test is everything. All your components should just have stories associated with them because that's how you build it. Nobody on the team understands tests, but everybody on the team understands stories because they're these visual things, and you can look at them and you can click on them. It's just a catalog of your UI. UI code is still really complex, but these kind of individual components are not complex when you write it that way. And we can test lots of states in parallel, like I showed you 2,000 tests in 45 seconds. So even though UI states are combinatorial, we mitigate that with speed. And every test is an integration test, and it still is. But we're able to control enough because these tests are built out in isolation that it allows us to run things quickly and predictably. So I believe that component-driven development is a fantastic solution to a class of test problems. When I got invited to give this talk, I was thinking about testing, and usually I'm not thinking about testing. Usually I'm thinking about building UIs and tools for building UIs. And so I was kind of thinking, like, what, I think the reason I wanted to give this talk is because I think there's probably, well, if you're doing UI stuff, you should be doing it this way. But there's also probably some things that could be learned from this technique because it works so well for this narrow domain, and maybe go out to the broader test community. And I was also thinking, what are we missing from the flow in Storybook, and what can we learn from like the best practice in this testing community? And so if I put my testing hat on and I look at Storybook, I think one of the big things is, how do I know when I'm done? I'm writing all these stories. I'm not thinking about testing. How do I know when I have coverage for those? And so I want to show a little demo of kind of a future feature for Storybook. It's very preliminary and kind of hacked together. And I left my laptop on the other side of the globe, so I'm showing you the hacked together demo. How do I get rid of this thing? I'm showing you the hacked together demo from yesterday on the temporary replacement laptop. So this is kind of, let me show you a quick example Storybook. Before I show you the toy Storybook, this is a real Storybook. And so this is basically like what it looks like when you build out an app in Storybook. So on the top here, you have these kind of low-level, like different cases for different individual kind of atomic elements here. And then down below, it goes all the way up to the screens. So this is kind of Chromatic's build screen, where you want to see like what's going on. It's loading the data right now. And then here's what it looks like with the data loaded. Each one of these rows is itself a component. And so this kind of composite test is kind of like an integration test for those lower level components, but I'm showing different states here. And then here's a different screen. Here's kind of the screen mocked out with dummy data and so on. So this is all production code, and basically the stories are always in sync with the production code. And now in this other window here, I'm going to show you the story coverage idea. And the idea here is, what would it look like to take kind of test coverage and translate it into this story view of the world. And so here I have a button. And it's the same example that I showed earlier. And it's got a single story, which is showing the button in its normal state. And so this is Storybook. I can click on the button. It's kind of mocked out some stuff. There's a whole bunch of different add-ons that you can add in for doing different things. But this one is we saw the examples earlier where we had like a loading state for the button. We said we could show a button as a button, or we could show it as a link. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but I saw it in some code somewhere, so I snipped it out. And so we're not really testing those things with our stories. And so that's why on the left-hand side of the button here, we have this little orange bar here. And if we click down here on coverage, we can see the source of the button. And basically, it shows 2 lines of code in the component itself that have not been executed via these stories. So if I open up the browser here and I go in and uncomment this code and save it, the link example has shown up. This is just a prototype, so the coverage itself takes a little while to update. But now we can see that that line has been executed, and the little dot has gotten yellow. And similarly, when we uncomment the loading story here and save it, this is what a loading button looks like. And hopefully in a second, Jest will run. And then here's what the kind of green coverage idea is showing up. So, so this is kind of, like I said, it's just a prototype. But I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas from the test world that can kind of make their way into the UI world. And I'm hoping to roll out story coverage as kind of a fully supported feature in Storybook in the next iteration. And it's an open source project, so if anybody here is interested in collaborating, we have about 800 contributors, and I love to work with different folks, so please check it out. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.